initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest, the NEA Big Read broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book. Showcasing a diverse range of contemporary titles that reflect many different voices and perspectives, the NEA Big Read aims to inspire conversation and discussion. Studies show that reading for pleasure reduces stress, heightens empathy, improves students' test scores, slows the onset of dementia, and makes us more active and aware citizens. The NEA Big Read annually supports approximately 75 dynamic community reading programs, and the selected communities receive a grant which ranges between $5,000 and $15,000, as well as other supporting resources. And we did a community survey last winter, and Lab Girl came out on top, which I think is always interesting how those folks come up. And this is by geobiologist Dr. Hope Duran. It's her memoir of growing up in a science lab in a small town in Minnesota and into a lab of her own. We thought it was a perfect opportunity to celebrate our own women in science here in Helena, and thanks to the professors at Carroll, we get to hear their experiences and stories, one scientist to another. The Lewis and Clark Library does have calendars and books available at the back table, and we're happy to answer any questions after the program. And please help me welcome tonight's panel moderator, Dr. Jennifer Glinka.
Good evening, thank you all for being here. As Suzanne said, I'm Jennifer Glinka. I'm the Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs at Carroll, and I've been a biology professor here for 16 years before that. So I came from doing a bachelor's degree in biology at Boise State University, and then my PhD at the University of Colorado, where at both places I studied plant biology, specifically conservation genetics of plants in undergraduate, and then my doctoral work was focused on fern biology and relationships in Hawaii. So for those of you who have read this book, it spoke to me on many, many levels, and I'm really excited to have this group of panelists here tonight to share their stories with you and kind of some connections to the book. And so what I'm going to have them do is I'll introduce themselves and give a little bit about their background, and then I've got some questions prepared for them to discuss, and then once we get through those, we'll open it up for a Q&A. One thing before I forget that I do want to mention is that this year for our theater program, the theme of the four shows, the four plays that they're putting on is Women in Science. And so this fits very nicely. So I encourage you, if you are interested, to check out their programming on the Carroll Theater webpage and to make it to as many of those productions as you can. Okay, so I'll have the panelists introduce themselves now, and we'll start with you, Patricia.
I'm Patricia Heiser, and I am using my here at. I came to Carroll College, I think, 6 years ago. And I grew up in Vermont and went to school there, and I couldn't decide on a major between geology and botany or ecology. So this book spoke to me in many ways as well, and I ended up going to graduate school in the University of Alaska, and ended up studying kind of Arctic climate change, geomorphology, but also paleoecology. So my inability to choose a major being young just has carried over into my whole career. And so I went to graduate school in Fairbanks and got my PhD there, and then bounced around a little bit and went to Ohio and Utah for a year, and ended up needing to be back in Alaska, and taught at the University of Alaska Anchorage for a while, and then ended back at University of Alaska Fairbanks where I got my PhD, and taught for 6 or 7 years there in the geography program. And this book was interesting also about thinking about curiosity-driven science and funding and the things that brought me to Carroll College. But part of it was long winters, but part of it was wanting to have a career in a different kind of institution, which is coming here. So, and here I research, I'm learning about Montana geology, I'm looking at Montana paleoecology, kind of, again, that intersection between geology and ecology. And I'm director of the environmental program also.
I'm kind of loud anyway, so.
My name is Caroline Farr. I am a chemistry faculty here. I actually went to Carroll as an undergrad, and I graduated in 2003. Then I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and I got my PhD in organic chemistry there. That's everyone's favorite subject, in case you were not aware. And then I was teaching in Pennsylvania for 3 years, and I got a call from a professor here saying there was a job application and asking if I would apply. And I said I hadn't thought about it, but my husband and I really wanted to get back to the West, and so now I'm here. And this is my 12th year teaching. It's my 9th year at Carroll. I have switched gears in my research program, which might come out later in another question, but I'm studying these crazy intermediate molecules that are found in interstellar space because they're so unstable. So that's what I'm doing in all my spare time when I'm doing research. It's an awkward mic. Transfer.
Hello, I am Julie Kessler. I am originally from the East Coast, grew up in Connecticut, and I went to an undergraduate institution called Hartwick College, much like Carroll College in upstate New York, in Oneonta. And then I went on to get my graduate degree at the University of Notre Dame in inorganic chemistry, which is the field that no one gets to because they stop after organic chemistry. So we call ourselves the opposite, but it's complementary in my opinion. I actually studied organometallic chemistry, so the intersection of metals with carbon bonds. Specifically designing and synthesizing catalysts for energy-related purposes, like converting carbon dioxide to methane or to methanol or formate or more useful chemicals. So there's an environmental perspective, an energy conservation perspective, and a sustainability perspective to my research. I have been at Carroll College for 2 full years. This is the start of my 3rd right now, so I'm very much getting my research program started, so I don't have as much to say about the changing of projects yet or establishment of research funding, but I can at least speak to trying to start a new program.
My name's Mary Keefe. I actually grew up in Bozeman. My father was actually a university professor in physics at Montana State. So I actually did go to physics labs rather early in my life, but it was a no-touch zone because things were very dangerous in that lab and expensive. I went to the University of Notre Dame where I majored in physics. I actually started out as an electrical engineer, liked chemistry, had loved chemistry in high school, and was looking at chemistry, physics, and electrical engineering. Got to my sophomore year, and I was going to have to make a decision at the end of the first semester because I couldn't afford to go 5 years. And so what was most interesting at that point was physics. And so I became a physics major. From there, I went to Cornell University in materials science and engineering. And I studied surfaces. In particular, I studied silicon surfaces and was looking at how atoms diffused on silicon surfaces. So silicon atoms diffused on silicon surfaces. And when I was in graduate school, when I entered graduate school, I planned on a heavy research career, even probably preferably at a national lab. When I was there, I ended up, for a variety of reasons, teaching or being a teaching assistant in several classes, and I really enjoyed that, and that shifted my focus. So I started thinking about a teaching career. I had been quite ill the last year I was in graduate school, and so I finished my thesis, and my husband and I moved to the suburbs of Chicago, where he took a job at Argonne National Lab. I worked at a community college a little bit. I worked actually with my father at a research institute in Wisconsin, just south of Madison. And then I took another job with a professor at Northwestern, all studying surfaces of various types and various techniques. And then I kind of was looking to come back west with my husband and I, and the job opened up at Carroll, and I came. I came to Carroll to teach physics. My job was, at the interview, it was physics, engineering, and mathematics. It was advertised as physics and engineering, and then they asked, once I was here, if I'd also teach calculus. And we did not have a physics program until about 6 years ago. It was our first, we instituted a major. So my research things here at Carroll have been more along the lines of projects for students this summer in particular, we worked on doing some quantum mechanics experiments.
Hi everyone, I'm Theresa McHugh. I grew up in South Texas and left as soon as I could. No offense to the Texans in the audience. I just love mountains. I did my undergraduate schooling, like Mary and Julie, at the University of Notre Dame.
I didn't know that about you either.
I started out as a biology major, but ended up majoring in environmental science. And I had some influential undergraduate research experiences in South Bend and in the Arctic that kind of set me on my path. I worked at the Biosphere 2 Center in Oracle, Arizona for a year after I graduated and got more research experience there, and ended up moving a little bit north to Flagstaff, Arizona to pursue a master's degree in biology at Northern Arizona University. After that, I had various jobs in public programs educating the general public about science. I worked at an arboretum, I worked at a natural history museum, I gave tours of the night sky at Lowell Observatory, and then eventually taught middle and high school science for 4 years in Flagstaff before going back to school and pursuing a PhD at NAU in Flagstaff. I did a year of a postdoc experience there at the Center for Science, Ecosystem Center for Science and Society. And my formal training is primarily in microbiology. I spent a year and a half as a postdoc at the U.S. Geological Survey in Moab, in Utah. And then I taught for 2 years at Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction before moving to Carroll last fall. And so this is my second year at Carroll teaching introductory biology and microbiology.
Okay. And I am Stephanie Otto-Hitt. I am in my 9th year here at Carroll College. I did my undergraduate at Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York. The accent might come out here and there. I also did my doctorate at Stony Brook in neuroscience. I started out as an undergraduate. I wanted to be an English major. I was told that English majors don't make any money when they graduate, and I needed to major in something useful. And so I switched over to science. I had, 7 or 8 different majors as an undergraduate, and it wasn't until I took a biopsychology course my junior year of college that I decided I wanted to pursue a degree in neuroscience. I didn't really know that that was a thing. And then as a doctoral student at Stony Brook, my main project was kind of looking at factors that make neurons, that make neurons different from all of the other cells in our body. So I helped to develop a technique that allowed us to specifically look at factors that kind of determine what cells become what during development. I then went to San Diego for 4 years where I did my postdoctoral research. The lab I was working at there, they did more cellular neuroscience, and so I was looking at factors that help stabilize connections between the brain cells once those connections form. And then when I was in my 3rd year as a postdoc there, I was on the R1 track, and I thought I was going to go to a big research university, and an opportunity came up to teach molecular biology to undergraduates. So my first teaching experience was a 5-week, 300-level molecular biology course to 145 students. I'd never taken molecular biology in my life, and here I was, the professor at UC San Diego, which was an incredibly competitive school with highly intelligent individuals. And it was a crash course, but it was great, and the rush I got from teaching and from engaging with my students was phenomenal, and I realized at that point that my calling was teaching, and I went on the job market pretty much a week after I stopped that course. I had no idea what I was doing. And I got the interview call from Carroll College, and I interviewed and fell in love, and so I've been here ever since. Okay, thank you all very much. So let's get into a couple of questions on the book. So one of the themes I think that is explored here is Hope really trying to define for herself what success as a scientist means, right? What success in science means. So how do you view success in science, and have your views on this changed over time? I'll open up to who, yeah, well, yeah, start.
Okay, I'll be the brave one. I think that's an interesting question. One of the things in the book that struck me, I'm sure most of you, it struck me for a couple reasons. One was that she was talking about the first time she ever discovered something that nobody else knew. And I actually never looked at science that way. When I found great feelings of success was actually when I got something to work, some stubborn piece of equipment that you spend months and then it finally is working and you get good data and it's like, wow, I got good data. The fact that nobody else didn't know the data, that didn't bother me. Didn't think anything about it. That's always been what I think of as success in the lab, is actually getting good data and not, like I said, not so much that it's mine and then I have to share it, but I got a good set of data that's reveals something about the universe, the small section of the universe, a surface of some kind. Later, I think when you get interested in teaching, the success becomes a little bit more, it becomes different. It's not always your personal accomplishment, it's helping somebody else become accomplished in science. And so your view of success changes to be, did you help somebody else become successful in the lab or in this academic classroom?
I think when I started out in grad school, success in science was doing good work, doing solid experiments, collecting good data, and then as I matriculated through, it was about publishing, getting grants, and publishing. Quality of data didn't seem to matter as much. It was about publishing. And it was about keeping a good publication record and writing grants. So that's kind of what it became.
I think I like this question because it's so different for everybody, but I think that publishing is a common theme. You'll hear the term publish or perish. And so at least as you begin graduate school, you might be told you cannot graduate until you have 3 publications or X publications, or you're an author on this many number of papers. And that's per the view of every instructor, I think, every PI, primary investigator on a project, or supervisor. And so a big question in coming to a school like Carroll, so most research schools, big universities, state schools, it is kind of a publish or perish nature, where you need to publish to get your name out there in order to achieve grants and then continue being successful, as Hope commented on a lot in her book. But at a school like Carroll, it's pretty different, and I think most of us are here because we didn't want to pursue an R1 type career at a university like that, or we did and maybe it wasn't what we thought it was, or discovered a love for something else. And so I think the focus of success is definitely different at a school like Carroll. And in that, I would agree that I find success and at least the most enjoyment in teaching my students how to do something new. So it's really fun to see some of you here tonight, especially as we brought in a new piece of equipment, learned how to install a glove box, how to use a glove box, because that was something that I trained on for 5 years and now got to bring to a small school like Carroll to do research projects that maybe we can't do at other small schools across the country.
I have to echo some of the same things. And I actually was at research schools until I came to Carroll, and it was part of my decision to come here. I went to a small liberal arts school and kind of always thought I wanted to teach at one, but it just never happened. I just ended up being at big research schools, partly because I wanted to be in the Arctic and my research was Arctic focused, so there I was. But it was very different. I mean, the pressure is very high, and I had a light research load because I had mostly an undergraduate program, so I had less pressure than a lot of my colleagues for that, but to support a graduate student is $40,000 a year to have a graduate student, and that's any grant under $250,000 just isn't worth getting, and I was told that. And so that was part of what, I mean, I came to Carroll kind of by accident, but I mean, I wasn't really looking, but I realized that with undergrads, for not a ton of money and just some passion and some time and interest, you can turn young people on to science. And my most exciting part in science was as an undergraduate doing a thesis. That's what turned me on. And so for me, success is seeing students get turned on to something and getting excited and not having a big giant grant or papers, obviously.
Well, I think that segues perfectly into kind of this next question, right, in which early on in the book, Hope talks about a very large grant that she got from the National Science Foundation, and she says, I wanted to be studying plant growth, but science for war will always pay better than science for knowledge. So what's your experience with funding for what she calls curiosity-driven research or curiosity-driven science, both before and at Carroll? And have you ever changed research directions for funding purposes?
I'm going to start on that because that's what I just ended with. But that is a lot of what brought me here. I had, I work in paleoclimate, climate change, and now that's much more out there, and so there's a lot more competition for climate change research. When I was doing it, it was kind of, ice ages, paleoclimate, and it wasn't that hard to get funding, and I was working with federal agencies, and I was getting pretty decent grants. But it became more competitive, and the requirements became you had to have global impacts, and you had to have collaboration. And I put together a proposal. It was a $3 million proposal with 16 collaborators, 8 co-PIs across 4 universities, and it got within like the top 7 or something. They funded, I missed it by about 3 through the National Science Foundation, and I was never more relieved in my life to have that turned down. And at first I was disappointed, then I'm like, oh my God, like I didn't want that at all. And that was all about getting the funding. And I had colleagues and mentors who said, you need a $3 million grant. That's what you have to have in your quiver or on your badge. And that's what I was going for. And I probably was encouraged to apply the next year. It was the biocomplexity program. I'm like, I was never so relieved to not get a grant. So then I realized then that wasn't my direction necessarily. And I still was at a research school for a while after that. But coming here and being able to fund small projects that are curiosity driven. I mean, I've supervised thesis on fire history, on tree ring fire history, charcoal, and cave lint in Lewis and Clark caverns. So, and my students' curiosity is what drives the projects that I'm able to supervise and help, and that is way more fun. So.
I just switched research pathways pretty significantly. So what I did in graduate school, I went to UW-Madison, and they had a lot of toys. It's a big school. So when I was going to go teach, I wanted to teach at a small school, and they wouldn't have all the same toys, but they would have lovely small classrooms full of students that I could interact with. So I was trying to pick a research program, and I'm an organic chemist, so we make things. So I was like, okay, I'm going to make these molecules, and they should emit blue light. And so they're organic light-emitting diodes. What's cool about them is that you can print a thin film of them onto almost anything, and they can make a display. So you could bend it in half, like this sheet of paper. They have displays that are almost this thin. You can bend them in half. And the blue light emitters had been struggling. So right when I was coming out of graduate school, this was kind of a hot topic. I made up this research proposal, and I took it to my first school. And I started training undergraduates on it, which was really fun and rewarding. But undergraduates don't have the time or the expertise that graduate students do. And I didn't have the time that the PI does at a big university. And so it seemed like we got further and further behind, like we couldn't keep up, and it was this really hot topic, and I didn't know better than to not maybe pick something that was just such a hot topic when you're competing against like industry and maybe someone more skilled than I could have done a better job, I don't know. But so we worked on this project for a while, and then last fall I was able to take a sabbatical, and it was like basically, you know, if you could make a cake from a box, that would be great. You could make a Martha Stewart cake, and that was what some of these techniques were like. It was like I was going in there and asking my students who like just started making cupcakes from the box to be like, make this Martha Stewart cake. And so it was just too technically challenging, and with the time it wasn't working. And so I had done this research in graduate school that was all about astrochemistry, and it was really cool, but I think I spent at least a solid year replacing O-rings as part of my PhD, like trying to find vacuum leaks and replacing O-rings in tiny spots. So I didn't want to do that, and I don't have a machine shop or an electronics shop or any of that stuff here. And so I decided I have to find a different way to access those molecules. So I did a bunch of research, and I was able to find a path that would let me get back to those types of molecules, but in a different way that wasn't so like troubleshooting oriented. And then one of the things I really considered was, how can I get this funded, right? So I wanted to do original research that would contribute to my field. I wanted it to be doable for undergraduates. I wanted it to be more bite-sized so that we didn't have to do quite as much to publish. I needed to be able to use just the instruments that I had here for the most part, although I was looking to collaborate with my old PI, which luckily he would do that. I wanted to be able to be funded, and we have a really nice Montana Space Grant Consortium in Montana, and they're sort of space-oriented, so I actually could get into that niche program, and they've been very supportive of our students here at Carroll. And so that's what I spent my sabbatical doing, was like looking at avenues that would tick all of those boxes, and I was able to come up with something. But it was an abrupt change from what I was doing, and I hadn't been doing astrochemistry for 12 years at that point, and I needed to find a different access point. So it was a good challenge, but I came back feeling really excited about being able to share that direction with my students. So that was like a long, yes, I've changed directions.
I've had some success in having curiosity science funded previously. I received a doctoral dissertation improvement grant when I was pursuing my PhD work at NAU, and during my first postdoc at NAU, I applied for another postdoc opportunity through the National Science Foundation, and my postdoc advisor said, "You have postdoc funding for 2 more years, why are you applying for another postdoc?" And the answer was, well, I was pursuing his questions of interest and I wanted to pursue mine. And at the time that was water from air as a source of moisture for microbes in arid climates. And it ended up getting funded, and it was a 3-year postdoc award that was about $300,000 in total, and it allowed me to move to Moab, Utah, which is a place where I wanted to be. And that was a really neat time in my life, and I think for a lot of scientists, the postdoc point in life is something that they look back on fondly. For those of us that did one, as honeymoon period for sure. But increasingly, I'm interested in helping the general public to better understand science and participating in activities that help to promote scientific literacy. And so engaging in opportunities like this one, where I can talk about my experiences with people who are interested but don't necessarily pursue science on a daily basis, is something that I see as valuable, especially in our changing world where science presently has been called into question. It's important for people to understand the nature of the changes that are taking place in our environment so that they can take steps within their personal lives to try to mitigate the bad things that are happening.
What I think this question could also get to is what you are telling people you're studying versus what you're actually studying. So when I signed up to be, when I was a graduate student, we did rotations in different labs to try to figure out the best fit for us. And my advisor sold me on his idea. It was amazing. We're gonna cure cancer. Not really. But a lot of, or like you're looking at molecules in space, but Caroline is not going to space to get these molecules, right? Like, what we end up spending a year on is trying to troubleshoot fixing an instrument, replacing O-rings ring by ring. And this is why it takes 5 or 6 years to get your doctoral degree, because you have to spend a year in classes, a year TAing, a year troubleshooting. So maybe you're in year 2 or 3 or 4 before you even start getting meaningful data, and then you need to spend time analyzing that data, realizing you're doing it wrong, and start again. So when someone tells you they're studying something, there's so much more that goes into it. And so we have this concept of what we plan to do, but there's so much that builds up to that process. And so you're hearing the big picture goal, which is amazing, but what you don't hear about are all of the failures that lead up to that. And so curiosity-driven research, so we can put forth these great ideas, but they're not very fundable necessarily, unless you can prove an obvious application. And so when we're writing grants, you have to find a grant or find a topic that's going to be fundable, and then think about how you can accurately fulfill that need, I guess, as to not misuse your money. But it takes a while to get there, is what we're saying with this. And so I guess curiosity-based research is hard to fund unless there's a very obvious application. And I think Hope, even in the book, talks about her field, and I don't know if it was paleobiology or what, I don't know.
She's geobotany.
Paleobotany, and she went through about, if we have X number of funding from the NSF, and we have X number of biologists in the state, that means each one can get funded this amount of money, which means each person can hire 1 student, or something like that. So it's really crazy how the money dwindles down so fast, and so that just speaks to how competitive the nature is and how profound your projects need to be. So at a small school like Carroll, and in my application to work here, we had to put forth research projects, and I probably spent 60 hours just trying to form an idea for one project to find that it had already been done. And so you have to go back and back and back again and reiterate and find projects that are feasible for young students in small chunks of time for many hands, that's interesting enough to be funded, but also that's unique enough that no one has been done. So it's really difficult to fill all of those needs at the same time.
I just want to say, one aspect I love most about doing research at Carroll is really putting students in the driver's seat as researchers. So when I started doing research at Carroll, I had a program funded for 6 years, and it was my research question and my research project that I was overseeing. And my model shifted quite significantly since then, in that I have students design their own research projects based solely on what they're interested in. And it's great, it's beautiful, because I get to see what you students out there are curious about, what you care about, what you're picking up in society, and what you think is impacting your generation. And you get to study that, and I get to learn so much every single time from what you guys do in my classes. And it's the most rewarding experience versus spending 30 years stuck on the same research question, and all the projects have to be geared towards answering this research question. I want to know what you guys care about, and I want to know what you're interested in, because I want, you're in the driver's seat now, right? And you're kind of driving your own car to your future, and I want to see what you care about. And so that's kind of my favorite thing about being at Carroll and doing research here, is because I love to see what you guys are curious about and see you get passionate about that.
I really appreciate Stephanie's response, and I honestly feel that mentoring is one of the greatest ways that we as scientists can help to enrich future science. And it was notably a piece that was lacking in this book. The support of the mentors that must have been involved to allow Hope to achieve the success that she's achieved today.
And appreciation of the role of future generations in moving science forward.
Okay, well, let's switch gears just a little bit. So Jaren describes some of the professional obstacles she has faced as a woman in a male-dominated field. And so I'm curious if you have experienced obstacles such as she describes, and if so, in what ways? How have you overcome those?
Can we turn the camera off?
am in geology, which is historically a very male-dominated field. And I never really thought about it that much, really. I was brought up in a household where there weren't really expectations related to your gender or anything. You know, my mom was a firefighter. So, and in college though, and I didn't really even notice it, but I had no female undergraduate geology professors, and very few in ecology too. That was my other major. And then I went to graduate school, and there were quite a few women there, and women graduates. Like, I just didn't think about it. And then I was in my first job interview, and I was in a room with like 7 men, all of them at least 15 years older than me. And it was the first time, really, actually, as far as kind of the professional field, that I realized that, wow, you know, this whole department is, and they had never had a woman on their faculty in geology. So, and a lot of my contemporaries who were graduating were becoming some of the first women in their departments. Where I found more kind of sexism and a challenge was working in the field, because I worked in Arctic Alaska, which is a pretty macho place, and it requires a lot of competence and confidence, and it's dangerous. And I encountered it in different situations where, you know, I think I had to argue with a pilot who was his first season flying in Alaska that we couldn't take off with my crew and my gear, and he was arguing with me, you know, and I was right. The clouds came in and we would be dead. But but then it wasn't always that way. So I kind of went through a period where I had to be macho, and I worked in Russia also, which was a really different situation, very sexist there, where the women scientists were on the field trips, but they were the cooks. So that was pretty interesting. But so I had to learn how to gauge when other people were seeing me as maybe incompetent, maybe just because I was a woman. And I had to sort of recite my Arctic fieldwork pedigree, so they were feeling fine. But then there were other people who didn't care at all, so I didn't have to be macho to other people, and I came off as a jerk. So you kind of had to learn to read where people saw you and understood, and you just had to earn respect. But I found one rule was sort of, men in the Arctic often had to earn disrespect, and women had to earn double respect. You know, it was just a little bit of an inequality that way. And that's gotten better. There's a lot more women field scientists in Alaska too, but, you know, again, I was on that earlier wave a little bit. But I didn't notice it in grad school, really, but in the field a little bit.
I didn't notice sexism until I started working either. I didn't notice it in graduate school really either. And then I think one thing that's challenging about being a woman in a male-dominated field, or maybe just being the minority in any situation, is that there's like your perspective and everybody else's, and if everybody else is the same, then that's hard sometimes. And you know, women don't get rewarded for the same personality attributes, I'll say, that men do sometimes. But to be a scientist, you sort of have to be bold and ask questions. And I mean, I guess you don't have to be that way, but let me just say it this way. If you're assertive as a woman, that's not always rewarded. But in order to get things done, you sometimes need to be assertive. So it's like kind of confusing, because either you're not doing that, so you're not doing your job, or you're doing that and some people are not appreciating it. Whereas I've often felt like if I was a man and I walked into a room and said all the same things and acted the exact same way, I would have a completely different reception from some people, not from all people, but from some people. And when I started, I was really young. I graduated from graduate school when I was 26. I defended my PhD, and then I turned 27 a couple weeks later. So I started teaching, and like my students couldn't really understand that I was a professor because I looked like them to them, and parents didn't think that I was a professor. I was teaching in the East, so it was a little more formal. I dressed up, I'm already 5'11", and I wore high heels, so at least everyone was like afraid of me. So that helped, like with the like setting up sort of the roles or whatever. But it was really interesting, and I've worked with a lot of great men, and one of the people that I've probably learned the most from is a colleague that I have here that's male, and he is just this remarkably curious person, and I was always so impressed by him. And now we have this team talk course, and I'm still very impressed by him, but it's like he's just not afraid of anything. He's not afraid to ask any question. He's not afraid to break something, even if it's like really expensive. He just doesn't, there's nothing that would get in the way of him trying to discover something. And that is not how I felt, that is not what I was rewarded for. I mean, there's just all these things that make it complicated. And one day he looked at me and he said, I think you really underestimate yourself. And he was like dead set, I mean, so serious. And I thought about it and I was like, I think I do too. And then I started working with him on these like collaborative projects, and one would be sort of my area. He would still just say whatever. He's like, maybe it's this. And I'm like, it's not that. He's like, okay. And it's like he was wrong, you know what I mean? Like, and it was fine. He didn't care. And it's like, I feel like sometimes as a woman, you're afraid of being wrong. But there's all these men that I work with, and they're never any less confident if they're going to be wrong. You know what I mean? And that's like that's the difference between sometimes my behavior. And I think I've learned the most from him. And I have a lovely department now where there's men and women and just a lot of collaboration. And it's a great environment. And I was lucky to have a really awesome female mentor when I first started. And that made a big difference for me as well. But it is challenging, I think. There's just some behaviors that are not taken as well from a woman as from a man. But I think those are the same types of behaviors that help me to be a successful scientist, some of them.
And I think another thing is that the woman-woman dynamic in science can almost be as intense as having the male woman. So I mean, because you have women that are kind of trying to prove themselves to colleagues in the lab and to their mentor, and then they're competing with other women in postdoc or, you know, as professionals to kind of compete for that attention too. So I mean, some of the most colorful interactions, I will say, I've had through my profession has actually been with other women in the lab environment as opposed to men in the lab environment, but it's mainly because of that dynamic and trying to, you know, garner that respect is one thing that I think also goes unnoticed, is that having to prove ourselves on that level also leads to this competition amongst women in that environment too.
So I come from an extremely heavily male-dominated field, and my first experience actually with being the only female in a class actually happened when I was in high school, and not in what I'd say is more traditional academic pursuits. My father, the physicist, thought it would be good if I learned how to weld. That would be helpful when I went to graduate school. And curiously, that was the one thing you were not allowed to do at Cornell if you were a graduate student. Worked in the machine shop, yes, but welding, no. So I was the only female in there, and the teacher and other male students incredibly supportive. Went to Notre Dame. Notre Dame was had been a male-only institution for a long time. When I was a junior, was the 10th year that they had the 10th year anniversary of admitting women into the university. And I was the only female physics major in my level. We had basically one female physics major in each grade level. And again, my teachers were very supportive. My classmates were very supportive. I went to graduate school. The research group I was in, incredibly supportive. Slightly more males than females, but not a huge number. And most of the department was very supportive of females. There was one, actually at that time, one of probably the youngest professor in the department, who asked a student who was a year younger than I was, told her she had announced she was getting married, and he said, you can't be serious about your career. And it was like, you know, she's coming to other female graduate students and saying, what do you think? And we're like, he's nuts, you know, don't listen to him. You got to do your own thing. I was also fortunate, I worked at a number of facilities that are called user facilities, where you go in and you sign up, you have to apply for time, and it gets awarded based on the research you're doing and how it grades out. And all of the technical staff, all of the people there that I ran to were incredibly supportive. So I was in a very male-dominated field, and there, I have to say, I didn't have a single female science instructor as an undergraduate. I did not have a single female instructor as a graduate student. And I worked for men when I was a postdoc. So, but I felt always very supported.
Oh, I think we could, yeah, we could talk about this for a very long time. I want to give the audience a chance to ask any questions that they might have, and I'm happy to bring around microphones. I've got more questions.
Just a general question. You talked about science literacy, which I think is hugely important. How does that translate to the general public, and what is your ideal to accomplish that, or to make a difference?
Good question. I've taken a couple of approaches to it personally. When I was a graduate student in Flagstaff, I created a science cafe called Science on Tap in 2011, and so it's still going on today. And so that's a meeting that happens informally once a month in a pub with a different speaker each time, presenting naked, which means not undressed, just without slides. Still hard in front of an audience. But that's one way that I was able to contribute a variety of science perspectives to a broad audience in a comfortable setting, and that has continued. In my absence, I only ran it for 3 years, and there were fortunately other graduate students who appreciated the benefit of it and have continued to make sure that happens each month. It's grown even. There's an astronomy science on tap version in Flagstaff now, too. And so Stephanie and I have talked a little bit about starting something like that here, where our Carroll students would be in charge of organizing it. It's challenging and an incredibly quick work week to find space for that, but it is something that I strongly believe in. Also, when I was in Moab, I started an annual festival of science that just celebrated its 3rd year. And that's something that happens on a single weekend in September and is intended to just get folks excited about a variety of topics and to provide hands-on experience in science for kids especially.
I was kind of fascinated by the equipment part of it, and you guys have all kind of mentioned building things, electrical shops, machine shops, which is new for me for science. If you guys can talk a little bit more about that aspect of building things, breaking things, inventing things. I thought that was really interesting.
We had when I was in graduate school, so the molecules that I studied they're really unstable, so they're found in interstellar space. Interstellar space is like 4 Kelvin. It's really, really cold. There's no energy there, and there's no neighboring molecules, so these really crazy intermediates can exist. So we had to mimic interstellar space in the lab. So we had these things that we called the carts. It was like this reinforced metal cart that had on it like a vacuum line, 2 different types of vacuum pumps, a helium compressor. So if you take helium and you compress it into a liquid, it gets to 4 Kelvin, so you can circulate that through the system and make it as cold as interstellar space. And the whole thing's under vacuum. So you just have all these things that have to work, and then there would never be a seal in the right spot, and so then you would put this whole thing together, deposit your sample, and then you would roll the entire thing into another instrument that you would take spectra on, so you could try to figure out what was going on. But it was, I mean, those things, I don't know how expensive they were, probably at least $60,000 to put together. but we had a machine shop, an electronics shop, there was a glass blower in the campus. So I just would go downstairs and say, Tracy, I want you to make me this. And he'd be like, no problem. This guy loved it hot too, so it was like 85 degrees in there all the time. And he wasn't wearing shoes most of the time, which I feel like is not kosher really, but he was down there. And then going back to sort of one of our other themes, we had this weird situation where I think it was the guys in the electronics shop it was like always kind of dicey when you went in there if you were a woman. Just never really went well. But then there was guys in the machine shop that didn't like one of my colleagues, and so we had a system where if he needed something, I would take it to the machine shop because they were nice to me, but if I needed something, he would take it to the electronics shop because it was nasty to go in there. So like that's the kind of thing that you sometimes set up, you know?
I think one thing a lot of people don't know about science is if you're asking new questions, you're trying to broaden an area and contribute new knowledge, you need new tools.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of times you need to develop tools from scratch. There's these questions out there. You come up with a question, there's no technique to answer it, right? So you need to actually not only come up with experiments to answer that question, but you actually need to develop the tools that have never been used before, in many cases, to actually answer that question. So there's a lot that goes into the process. It's not like everything's already set out, like, a surgeon comes in with his preset little, fold out of tools. You need to actually invent and make your own tools so that you can push the boundaries of science and ask new, interesting questions.
My research students this summer were setting up a laser. That's what they were doing in this back room. And yeah, they did it. It was awesome. They like read the manual and set stuff up and focused it and then built this janky cardboard thing so that you wouldn't walk in and be like, oh, a laser. It was crazy. They were hilarious just that, getting in there, doing it. And it was like, that was what was so fun, was to see them just set up a laser.
We have much more lowbrow MacGyver tools.
Yeah.
Kayak, bungee cords, soda mount to our boats for mapping lake bottoms. But still, you have to invent things all along. So many inventors.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're trained in it, you have to figure it out one way or another, because we have, how much do we analyze? How much that costs?
Oh, that's a $400,000 piece of equipment.
So $400,000 piece of equipment that broke this summer when I was the only one doing research due to a power outage, we think, and that caused one primary issue and then a secondary issue, and then it prevented us from doing research for about 2 months, like through all of August and mostly through September until we were able to get something replaced. But even finding the time to troubleshoot and then being able to remove this piece of equipment, that's $55,000 of $400,000 that we now need to ship across the country. And
it has its own briefcase, and it has like a little tiny Allen wrench, and I'm like laying underneath this thing. I'm like, is this the right one? And John's holding it, and he's like, I think it's going to start to come out faster, as it comes out of the magnet. And I was like, okay, well, I'm kind of worried it's going to drop on my face. And he's like, I think I have it, and also the cost of your surgery will be less than this probe. I was like, that's not reassuring.
that's why you wear goggles, because she dropped the screwdriver on her
I know, I
face.
was so nervous I kept dropping the little baby Allen wrench onto my goggles, so it's important to wear protective eyewear.
Those are just the things you have to do at a small school, especially when you don't have an instrument technician, an electronics shop, a glass blowing shop, any mechanics. You are those people, so on top of your teaching and on top of your research and everything else you're supposed to do, you have to fit that in and make it work, or else it doesn't happen. So you really kind of have to learn along the way.
Yeah. I went to a big research institution, and the word was, you don't take the electronics to the electronics shop, period. It doesn't matter who's taking it.
Is that what it is?
You took it, you didn't see it again, period. It sat on a shelf and was never fixed. So you learn a lot more electronics than you ever really planned on. Yeah. Yeah. No, I learned a lot more electronics than I ever thought I would do. Yeah.
Do you feel that these challenges with funding and equipment at a smaller school makes you a better scientist in some way?
I think it makes you more creative, more innovative, a different scientist.
Don't you? I think though, I spend a lot of time trying to get my students to fix things too, and that's not really something that I did when I was an undergraduate. So, to go to graduate school or wherever, become a physician, whatever they want to do, like if they've done that here and they're not afraid to do it because someone encouraged them to do it, I just think that's a huge asset for the next step. Because part of what holds you back, I think, particularly as a woman, is that you're not necessarily encouraged to take things apart, or you're worried something's going to break. Or so if you have someone telling you, no, take it apart, it's already broken. we'll figure it out, you know, I mean, just, it makes a big difference, I think.
I do think it helps you build another skill set. So I didn't want to fix any of these instruments per se, because again,
Where's the lab manager?
I'm not the person who takes it apart, and like I'm afraid that I'll lose a piece or I won't put it back together the right way. But also, like, I agree, I never fixed anything as an undergraduate, and so I think that speaks a lot to what we make our students do, or ask our students to do, I should say, because they
Allow them the opportunity.
So they've written a lot of manuals for us, so sometimes at the end of our projects, what we'll have them do is we'll have them write a user manual for this instrument or for this instrument, or call the company to talk about how this is broken and have them sit on the computer for 2 hours over the phone watching them put things, you know? So those are things that our students get to do, which I think is more representative of really what science looks like sometimes, which is not always how you plan or want to spend your day, but a lot of new skills.
You say that, like, meeting some different colleagues in your field, they were they were really confident with their knowledge. Was it hard for you guys to gain that confidence when you first started teaching?
I was pretty confident in my teaching, I think, just because I really liked people, and I felt like I could read people, and, you know, when you see someone like, you know that they need help, you know, but I think they call it imposter syndrome. I felt like that a lot as a researcher at the beginning, and I've talked to a lot of other women that felt like that at the beginning too, and I remember being really worried about starting and thinking, oh, I'm not going to know anything, and then I started teaching undergrads, and I was like, oh, they don't know how to do anything. I mean, you just don't, like, you can't quantify what you learned in graduate school because you're not taking classes anymore. Like, you're getting these experiences, and you're so used to, I took this class, I know these things. I took this lab, I know these things. And that's not how graduate school is. So I was seriously underestimating what I knew how to do and seriously overestimating what my undergraduates would know how to do. And that's not because they're not smart. The students at Carroll are amazing. It's just because they haven't had the experiences. And so, but it took me a long time, I think. And it took me, honestly, John and my husband. My husband's also super curious and takes everything apart all the time. And then having kids, I think, and having a little girl, she's 4 now. When I left, she was actually doing experiments. She had a bunch of water glasses out, and she was mixing different colors of food dye. And I was like, bye, and she's like, see you later, Mom. Focused, but I don't know, she's so curious, and, you know, and to think about how I can make such a big difference for her and my husband by never, you know, always answering her questions and always encouraging her to ask questions and telling her that that's the right thing to do and that she should be proud of that. And if someone is someday irritated by that, that's a their problem, not a your problem. So I'm hoping that she won't have to have quite the transition that I did, but I will say I felt really fortunate to have many great female mentors and then just a lot of great colleagues too that have helped me develop. Now I feel more comfortable.
Sometimes I think I wish I could go back and do my PhD after having taught. Because I agree, you know, you kind of, when you start off really young, you kind of do have that imposter syndrome, and there's a lot to learn, and there's all this having to prove yourself. But after having teaching and gaining that confidence and having this wide body of knowledge and really knowing at an intimate level how things work, I now feel like if I had gone back and done research, I would have been much more successful. Because through graduate school, through your postdoc, you're kind of pigeonholed into a particular area, a particular question that you need to follow through for years and years on end, but having this huge body of knowledge that you're so much more intimate with, because now you need to be able to communicate it and package it for a large audience. Having that ability, I think, if I were to go back to do a PhD, would just make me a much stronger researcher. And I think it does make me a stronger researcher now.
Your question, I had a job it was my first tenure track job, and, you know, I guess when you go to school for a long time, and even when you get your PhD, I mean, you're really knowledgeable about something this big, very narrow, and the rest, you know, you don't know about. And I was at Ohio University, and I was going to teach a soils class, and I had one undergrad kind of soils class. It was about feeding corn, and then I had Arctic permafrost soils course as a graduate student, and I'm teaching soils at Ohio, and I was like, I don't think I can do that. And he said, well, we didn't hire you for what you already know. We hired you for how fast you could learn something and teach it the next day, if that's what it takes. And I'm like, as long as we understand that. But it was true. It's like, no, you no longer do you have to get knowledge from a class or somebody else. You have to find it out yourself. And that's one thing I try to torture my students with. It's like, we can help you along, but the greatest skill is learning how to learn yourself. And the sooner you learn how to do that, the more confidence you have, because you don't feel so much as an imposter. It's like, I've never had a soils class. I've never even dug a hole in Ohio. So how would I teach this class? And I was sometimes digging a hole the day before lab. And like, okay, well, yeah, look at that, you know. But that's, you know, once you realize that you can really learn anything, and when you realize you're teaching people, they don't know that you're learning it the day before, it helps.
Or you can have your students do it for you. It works. I knew that was gonna happen.
Well, teaching on a, you know, learn content on a need-to-know basis. And that's actually a pedagogy. Like, ask a question and then have students realize that they need to learn this stuff. Instead of us telling them learn these things, you know, trying to solve a problem, then you have to learn the things. And I think it means more and sticks more that way. And the idea that you can learn anything, so.
Okay, well, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's just a little bit past 8 o'clock. So I'm sure that if you have any other questions for our panelists, they'd be happy to stay and chat with you for a little bit.